Hi guys, tonight we explore a land that seems familiar, yet quietly holds a secret beneath its surface. You step into the early morning air of a vast plateau where the light spreads gently across mountains that have stood for thousands of years. The wind moves softly over dry earth, carrying with it echoes of names that have changed, shifted, and endured. You hear one name most often in the stories you remember: Persia. It feels ancient, almost poetic, a word that seems to belong to empires, kings, and distant legends. But as you stand here, something feels slightly different. The people around you do not call their land Persia. They speak another name: Iran. This is where the quiet mystery begins. A widely accepted historical fact is that the term Persia comes from the ancient region of Pars or Persia in the southwest of the country. Greek historians, especially those writing about the wars between the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states, use this regional name to describe the entire empire. Over time, this external label spread across Europe and beyond, becoming the dominant name used in maps, books, and conversations. And so for centuries, the world knew this land as Persia. But as you look around, you begin to sense that this name only tells part of the story. The air is cool, and the distant hum of a waking city surrounds you. Somewhere a door opens, footsteps move across stone. Life continues just as it has for generations, yet beneath these ordinary moments lies a deeper continuity, something older than the name Persia itself. A lesser-known detail is that the people of this land have referred to their homeland as Iran for far longer than most outsiders realize. The word comes from an ancient term meaning land of the Aryans, a phrase that once described a broad cultural and linguistic group spread across parts of Eurasia. Long before modern politics gave the word new and controversial meanings elsewhere, here it simply referred to a shared heritage and identity. You begin to realize that Persia and Iran are not opposites, but layers. One is the name given by outsiders, shaped by encounters, wars, and storytelling. The other is an internal identity rooted in language, myth, and memory. For centuries, these two names existed side by side, rarely conflicting yet never fully merging. As you walk further, the landscape seems to reflect this duality. Ancient ruins sit quietly beside modern roads. A structure built in one era stands next to something shaped by another. Nothing feels entirely replaced. Instead, everything feels added like pages in a long and continuous story. Scholars remain divided about why the name Persia persisted so strongly in the outside world for so long. Some suggest it was simply habit reinforced by classical education in Europe, where Greek and Roman texts shaped understanding of the past. Others believe it reflected a deeper tendency to simplify complex regions into single recognizable labels. Either way, the result was the same. The world held on to Persia even as the people within the land continued to say Iran. You pause for a moment listening. There is a rhythm here, something steady and unhurried. It feels older than any one empire, older than any single ruler or dynasty. It is not tied to borders or politics alone. It is something cultural, something human. You begin to sense that identity in this place is not fixed in one moment. It shifts, adapts, and continues. Persia was not replaced by Iran. Instead, Iran contains Persia just as the present contains the past. A curious detail that often goes unnoticed is how language itself preserves this continuity. The Persian language known as Farsi still carries echoes of ancient words and structures. Even after invasions, cultural changes, and political transformations, the language remained a thread connecting generations. When people speak, they are not only communicating in the present, they are also, in a quiet way, carrying forward something that has existed for thousands of years. You walk along a path that feels both new and ancient at the same time. The sunlight grows warmer, now touching the edges of buildings and casting long, gentle shadows. Somewhere nearby you hear voices and conversation. The tone is calm, familiar, grounded in everyday life. And yet behind these simple exchanges lies a history that stretches back far beyond what can be seen. You begin to understand that the question is not simply when Persia became Iran. The deeper question is how a land can hold multiple identities at once without losing itself. Historians still debate whether the shift from Persia to Iran represents a true transformation, or simply a change in how the country presents itself to the outside world. Some argue that the identity remained fundamentally consistent, shaped by culture rather than names. Others believe that political decisions in the modern era gave new meaning to the name Iran, turning it into something more than just a traditional term. As you continue walking, the answer does not come all at once. Instead, it unfolds slowly like the landscape itself. Each step reveals another layer, another connection, another quiet detail that adds to the whole. You pass by a place where the past feels closer. Perhaps it is the shape of the architecture or the way the light falls across stone. For a moment, it is easy to imagine that time has folded slightly, bringing different eras into the same space. You realize that this journey is not just about history in the usual sense. It is about perception. The world once looked at this land and saw Persia a powerful empire that shaped early civilization. The people within it saw Iran a homeland defined by deeper roots and shared identity. Both views are real. Both are incomplete on their own. And now as you stand here between them, you begin to see how they fit together. The air feels softer now, as if the day is settling into a quieter rhythm. You take a slow breath, letting the stillness around you sink in. There is no urgency here, no need to rush forward. The story will reveal itself in time. For now, you simply remain present, aware of the ground beneath your feet and the long history that surrounds you. Somewhere in the distance, the past continues to whisper, and you are just beginning to listen. You let the present fade slightly, as if stepping backward through a quiet doorway in time. The city softens its sounds, becoming distant, replaced by something more elemental. The ground beneath your feet feels less shaped, less defined. The air is wider, emptier, carrying the scent of dry grass and open land. Long before the name Persia ever reached the ears of distant civilizations, before empires rose and fell, this land was already alive with movement. A widely accepted historical fact is that the Iranian plateau has been inhabited for thousands of years, with early human settlements dating back to at least the Neolithic period. Small communities formed near rivers and fertile valleys, where people learned to cultivate crops, domesticate animals, and build the first stable societies. These early inhabitants did not yet think in terms of nations or empires. Their world was local, shaped by survival seasons and the rhythm of the land. You imagine yourself among them. The mornings begin with quiet activity. Hands move over soil, tending to crops that must be carefully maintained. Fires are lit not for comfort alone, but for necessity. Every action feels deliberate, connected to something essential. There is no excess here, only balance. A lesser-known detail is that some of these early communities developed surprisingly complex systems of water management. In a land where water could be scarce, they created underground channels known as qanats, which carried water from distant sources to where it was needed most. These systems, built with remarkable precision, allowed settlements to thrive in areas that might otherwise have been uninhabitable. Even today, traces of these ancient techniques remain in use, a quiet testament to their ingenuity. You walk along what might once have been a simple path worn into the earth by repeated footsteps. It does not lead to a grand city or a monumental structure. Instead, it connects small spaces, places where people gathered, worked, and rested. There is no single identity, yet no unified culture that defines the entire region. Instead, there are many groups, each with their own traditions, languages, and ways of life. Some move with herds across open land, following seasonal patterns. Others remain in settled areas, building homes from mud brick and shaping the beginnings of community life. Archaeologists continue discussing whether these early groups shared a common cultural identity, or if they were largely independent from one another. Some evidence suggests connections through trade and shared technologies, while other findings point to distinct local traditions that develop separately over time. The truth, like much of early history, remains partially hidden, waiting to be uncovered piece by piece. As you move further into the fierce, distant past, you begin to notice something else. Movement, not just within a single community, but across vast distances. Groups of people begin to migrate, carrying with them languages, beliefs, and ways of understanding the world. Among these movements are the early Indo-Iranian peoples, whose arrival will quietly shape the future of this land in profound ways. A commonly overlooked detail is how language plays a role in this transformation. The Indo-Iranian languages, part of a larger Indo-European family, begin to spread across the region. These languages carry shared roots, similar structures, and familiar sounds. Over time they evolve into distinct forms, but they retain a sense of connection that links distant communities together. You hear fragments of a speech unfamiliar yet strangely rhythmic, words that will one day echo in Persian, in other language, in stories that have not yet been told. This is where something subtle begins to form. Not a nation, not an empire, but a foundation. You begin to sense how identity does not appear suddenly. It builds slowly, layer by layer, through shared experiences, migrations, and adaptations. The people here do not yet call themselves Iranian, in the way the term will later be understood. But the roots of that identity are already taking shape, embedded in language, in movement, in the quiet continuity of life. The landscape itself seems to guide this process. Mountains create natural boundaries, shaping where people settle and how they interact. Deserts limit movement, encouraging innovation in survival. Valleys offer opportunity, drawing communities together. Every feature of the land plays a role in shaping the human experience. You pause near a simple dwelling, imagining the lives within it. There is no written history yet to record their names or stories. No grand monuments or to mark their existence. And yet their influence will endure in ways they could never have imagined. Scholars remain divided about how directly these early Indo-Iranian groups can be connected to later Persian identity. Some argue that the link is clear, supported by linguistic and cultural continuity. Others caution that the passage of time and the mixing of populations make such connections more complex than they first appear. What is certain is that something began here, something that would continue to evolve across centuries. The wind moves gently across the land, carrying dust and the faint sounds of life. You feel a quiet respect for these early moments, for the people who lived without knowing the significance of their place in history. They were not building an empire. They were simply living, adapting, surviving. And yet from these small beginnings, something larger would grow. You begin to step forward again, the distant past slowly giving way to something more structured, more recognizable. The scattered communities will one day give rise to organized societies. Languages will become more defined. Beliefs will take clearer shape. The name Persia has not yet been spoken, but the story that will lead to it is already unfolding. You take one last look at this early world where identity exists not in words but in lived experience. It is quiet, almost invisible, yet deeply real. Then slowly you continue forward. The land is changing, and with it the people who will one day give it a name. You move forward through time, and the scattered rhythms of early life begin to gather into something more structured. The land no longer feels defined only by small communities and quiet survival. There is movement on a larger scale now. Roads begin to form, messages travel farther, power starts to concentrate. The air feels charged with possibility. You find yourself standing at the edge of a growing force, one that will soon stretch far beyond this plateau. A widely accepted historical fact is that around the 6th century BCE, a leader named Cyrus the Great rises from the region of Persis and begins to unite various tribes and territories under a single rule. What begins as a local consolidation quickly transforms into something much larger. You sense the shift immediately. Where there was once fragmentation, there is now direction. Where there were isolated groups, there is now connection. Cyrus does not simply conquer. He organizes. He builds alliances. He creates a system that allows diverse peoples to exist within a shared framework. You walk along a newly formed road, its surface worn by the passage of travelers, soldiers, and officials. It stretches far into the distance, connecting places that once felt impossibly far apart. This is not just a path, it is a symbol of a new kind of world. A lesser known detail is that Cyrus established policies that were remarkably progressive for their time. Instead of forcing conquered peoples to abandon their traditions, he often allowed them to maintain their religions, languages, and customs. This approach was not only humane but practical. It reduced resistance and helped stabilize a rapidly expanding empire. Some accounts even describe how he permitted displaced communities to return to their homelands, an act that would later be remembered in various cultural traditions. You begin to see how power here is different. It's not built only on force but on structure. The empire grows steadily. Lands that once existed separately now fall under a single authority. From the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia to the distant edges of Central Asia, a vast network begins to take shape. And yet despite its size, it does not feel chaotic. There is an underlying order, something carefully maintained. You pass through what might be an early administrative centre. Officials record information, track resources, and communicate across long distances. The scale of coordination is difficult to grasp, yet it functions with surprising efficiency. Historians still debate whether Cyrus's reputation as a benevolent ruler reflects reality or later idealization. Some sources portray him as unusually just and compassionate, while others suggest that these accounts may have been shaped by those who benefited from his rule. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. What remains clear is that his leadership left a lasting impression. You continue walking and the empire begins to reveal itself more fully. There are signs of planning everywhere. Roads are not random, they are deliberate, designed to connect key regions. Messengers move quickly, carrying information across vast distances. This system allows the empire to function as a whole rather than as disconnected parts. A curious detail that often goes unnoticed is the development of the Royal Road, a network that enabled communication and travel across the empire at remarkable speed for its time. Riders could carry messages from one end of the empire to another in a matter of days, a feat that would have seemed almost impossible in earlier periods. This network did more than move information. It created a sense of unity, linking distant regions into a shared system. You pause for a moment, taking in the scale of it all. This is no longer just a land, it is an empire, and with it something else begins to form. Identity. For the first time, people across vast distances are connected not only by trade or migration, but by a shared political structure. They may speak different languages, follow different traditions, and live in different environments, but they are now part of something larger. You begin to understand how the name Persia will emerge from this. It is tied to this region, to this moment, to the rise of a power that captures the attention of the wider world. Outsiders will look at this empire and see its origins in Persis, and they will use that name to describe the whole. But from within, the story is more complex. You move through a space where cultures meet. A merchant speaks one language, a soldier another, an official yet another. And still they interact, exchange, and cooperate within the same system. It's not uniform, but it is connected. Scholars remain divided about how unified the Achaemenid Empire truly was in terms of identity. Some argue that it was primarily an administrative structure with limited cultural integration. Others believe that over time, shared experiences within the empire began to create a broader sense of belonging. The reality may be a balance between these views. You continue walking and the presence of Cyrus still lingers. Though he is no longer physically present in every place, his influence is everywhere. In the systems that organize the empire, in the policies that shape its governance, in the way people move trade and live within its boundaries. There is a quiet confidence here, a sense that something significant has been achieved. The sun begins to rise higher, casting a warm light across the land. The shadows grow shorter and the details of the empire become clearer. You can see how each part connects to the next, forming a network that spans continents. This is the moment when Persia as the world will come to know it truly begins. Not just as a place, but as an idea. A powerful, organized, and far-reaching civilization that leaves a mark on history. And yet even as it rises, you sense that this is only one layer of a much longer story. The deeper identity of this land, the one that will later be called Iran, continues to develop beneath the surface. You take a slow breath, feeling the weight of history around you. Then gently you move forward. The empire is only just beginning to unfold. You continue forward and the empire around you begins to feel less like a sudden creation and more like a living system, steady and expansive. The roads you noticed earlier now carry a constant rhythm of movement. Messengers pass swiftly, traders move with quiet purpose. Officials travel between distant regions carrying decisions that shape lives far beyond their origin. This is no longer just the rise of power, it is the practice of governing it. A widely recognized historical reality is that the Achaemenid Empire developed one of the most advanced administrative systems of the ancient world. Under rulers like Darius I, the empire was divided into provinces known as satrapies, each overseen by a governor. These satraps were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and reporting back to the central authority. It is a structure that allows something vast to remain manageable. You walk through one of these regions, noticing how different it feels from another you passed earlier. The clothing changes slightly, the language shifts, the architecture adapts to local materials and traditions, and yet there is something consistent beneath it all: order. A lesser-known detail is how carefully the empire monitored its own officials. Inspectors, sometimes referred to as the king's eyes and ears, travelled across the empire without warning, observing governors and reporting directly to the ruler. This quiet system of oversight helped prevent corruption and rebellion, ensuring that even distant provinces remained connected to the centre. You begin to sense how trust and control are balanced here, not through constant force but through awareness. As you move along a marketplace, the sounds around you blend into a soft, steady hum. Different languages rise and fall in conversation. Goods from distant lands are exchanged with practiced ease. There is a feeling of openness, as though the empire itself encourages connection rather than isolation. Some researchers question whether this tolerance was purely strategic or reflected a deeper cultural philosophy. Allowing local customs and religions to continue certainly reduced resistance, but it may also have created a more stable and cooperative society. Either way, the result is clear. Diversity does not weaken the empire, it strengthens it. You pause near a group of travellers resting in the shade. Their clothing suggests they have come from far away. One speaks of mountains beyond your sight, another describes rivers that flow through lands you have not yet seen. And yet here they are, gathered in a shared space connected by the invisible threads of this vast system. A curious detail that often escapes attention is the role of standardized systems in maintaining this unity. The empire introduced consistent weights measures, and even a common currency in many regions. This made trade more predictable and efficient, allowing goods and ideas to move with less friction. It is a quiet innovation, but one that shapes daily life in profound ways. You begin to notice how these systems create a sense of reliability. People know what to expect, they understand the rules even if they live far from the centre of power. This predictability allows life to flow more smoothly, reducing uncertainty in a world that could otherwise feel unpredictable. The sun is now higher and the warmth spreads gently across the land. Shadows soften and the details of daily life become clearer. You see farmers working fields that have likely been cultivated for generations. Artisans shape materials into tools and decorations. Children move through the spaces between adults, learning simply by observing. This is where the empire truly lives, not in palaces alone, but in ordinary moments. Archaeologists continue discussing whether the Achaemenid Empire created a shared cultural identity among its people or simply maintained a network of distinct societies under one rule. Some evidence suggests that local traditions remain dominant, with only limited blending. Others point to subtle influences that spread across regions, shaping art, architecture, and governance in ways that reflect a broader connection. You walk past a structure that feels both official and welcoming. Inside, records are kept with careful attention. Symbols and markings capture information that must be preserved. It is not just about control, it is about memory. The empire records itself, ensuring that decisions and actions are not lost to time. A lesser-known aspect of the Thetis system is the use of multiple languages in official inscriptions. Instead of relying on a single tongue, the empire often communicated in several, including Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. This approach reflects a practical understanding of diversity, acknowledging that communication must adapt to reach different peoples. You begin to feel how deliberate everything is. Nothing here seems accidental. Each system Each decision, each structure contributes to a larger whole. And yet, despite this complexity, the empire does not feel overwhelming. It feels balanced, as though it has found a rhythm that allows it to function smoothly. You take a slow breath, letting the atmosphere settle around you. There is a quiet confidence in this place, a sense that the system works because it respects the differences within it. It does not demand uniformity. Instead, it creates a framework where variety can exist without causing fragmentation. As you continue walking, you begin to understand why this empire leaves such a lasting impression on those who encounter it. It's not only its size that matters, it is how it holds itself together. Scholars remain divided about whether this model of governance influenced later empires directly, or if similar systems developed independently in different regions. Some see clear lines of inspiration, while others suggest that the challenges of managing large territories naturally lead to comparable solutions. What is certain is that the Achaemenid approach stands as one of the earliest and most effective examples. The day moves forward and the rhythm of the empire continues around you. Nothing feels rushed. Nothing feels chaotic. It is a world in motion, yet held together by invisible structures that guide it quietly. You realize that this is more than a moment in history. It is a blueprint, and even as time will move on as empires rise and fall, something of this approach will remain echoing in systems yet to come. You continue forward, carrying with you the sense of balance you have witnessed. The story is deepening now, and the identity of this land is becoming clearer not through a single name, but through the way it lives. You move onward, and something subtle begins to shift in the way this land is seen. The empire still breathes around you with quiet strength, its system steady, its diversity intact. Yet beyond its borders, far from the roads you walk and the voices you hear others are watching, they're trying to understand what this place is, and in doing so they begin to give it a name. A broadly accepted historical understanding is that the term Persia comes from the region of Persis, located in the southwest of the empire, which the ancient Greeks encountered during their conflicts with the Achaemenid rulers. When Greek historians such as Herodotus wrote about this vast empire, they used the name associated with this region to describe the entire civilization. Over time, this label spread across the Greek world and later into Roman and European traditions. You begin to sense how powerful naming can be. From where you stand within the empire, the identity feels layered and expansive, but from the outside it becomes simplified. A single word is chosen, repeated and remembered. Persia. You imagine the perspective of those distant observers. They do not see the full complexity of satrapies, languages and traditions. They encounter armies, emissaries and stories of wealth and power. They hear of kings whose influence stretches across continents. And so they attach a name that feels clear and recognizable. A lesser-known detail is that the inhabitants of the empire themselves did not commonly use the word Persia to describe their entire land. Instead, they referred to themselves in ways that reflected their local identities or broader cultural terms that would later evolve into the idea of Iran. This difference between internal and external naming quietly shapes how history will be remembered. You walk through a gathering place where travelers exchange stories. One speaks of distant lands to the west where people describe this empire in terms of its rulers and its might. Another mentions how the name Persia carries a sense of grandeur, almost mythic in those regions. It becomes a symbol, not just a place. You begin to understand that the name Persia is not incorrect, but it is incomplete. Some researchers question whether the Greek use of Persia was simply a practical choice, or if it reflected a deeper tendency to define other civilizations through limited contact. When knowledge comes through conflict or trade, it often captures only certain aspects. The result is a name that highlights one part while overlooking others. The sun drifts slightly lower and the light softens across the land. You notice how the same place can feel different depending on how it is seen. From within, it is layered, nuanced, alive with variation. From afar, it becomes a single image shaped by distance and interpretation. A curious detail that often goes unnoticed is how enduring this external name becomes. Even long after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, even as new dynasties rise and reshape the region, The word Persia continues to be used in foreign texts, maps, and conversations. It carries forward almost unchanged, as if anchored in the memory of those early encounters. You pause near a structure where inscriptions are carved into stone. They speak in multiple languages, reflecting the empire's diversity. They record achievements, declarations, and identities. And yet none of them use the word Persia in the way outsiders do. The contrast is quiet but striking. You begin to see how two parallel narratives form. One exists within the land itself, evolving naturally through language, culture, and continuity. The other exists outside, shaped by observation, storytelling, and repetition. Both influence how this place is understood, but they do not always align. Scholars remain divided about how much this external naming affected the internal identity of the people over time. Some suggest that the name Persia had little impact within the region, remaining largely a foreign term. Others believe that prolonged interaction with the outside world may have gradually influenced how the land presented itself. The evidence offers hints but no single conclusion. You continue walking and the atmosphere feels thoughtful, almost reflective. There is a quiet realization forming. Identity is not only something you define for yourself, it is also something others define for you. And sometimes those two versions exist side by side for centuries. You pass by a group of artisans working carefully with their hands. Their focus is on their craft, not on names or labels. They shape materials into forms that will endure just as their culture continues to endure beneath shifting perceptions. In these small, steady actions, you see something that does not depend on what the outside world calls this place. It simply is. The light grows warmer, and the sounds around you soften into a gentle rhythm. You feel a sense of continuity, as though the deeper identity of this land remains steady, even as its name changes depending on who speaks it. You take a slow breath. The name Persia will travel far. It will appear in books, in maps, in conversations across continents. It will shape how generations understand this land. But beneath it, something older remains. Something quieter. Something that has not yet fully revealed its name to the world. You continue forward, carrying this awareness with you. The story is not just about what this land is called, it is about what it has always been. You move forward and the steady rhythm of the empire begins to shift. The order you felt earlier, the balance that held vast lands together, now carries a faint tension beneath it. Messages travel faster. Movements feel more urgent. Something approaches from beyond the familiar horizon. You sense it before you see it. A widely recognized historical event is that in the 4th century BC, the Achaemenid Empire faces a powerful challenge from a young Macedonian king, Alexander the Great. His campaign begins far to the west, but it moves steadily eastward, gaining momentum with each victory. What once seemed distant now draws closer with quiet inevitability. You imagine standing at the edge of this unfolding moment. There is no single instant when everything changes. Instead, it happens gradually. Reports arrive of battles lost. Cities that once felt secure now seem vulnerable. The confidence of the empire begins to waver, not all at once, but in subtle ways. You walk along a road that once carried only trade and administration. Now it carries something else. Uncertainty. A lesser-known detail is how the fall of the Achaemenid Empire was not solely the result of overwhelming force. Internal weaknesses, including political tensions and struggles for power, had already begun to affect stability before Alexander's arrival. These fractures made it more difficult for the empire to respond as a unified whole. What appears from the outside as a swift conquest is in part the result of deeper vulnerabilities. You begin to see how even the most organized systems can shift when pressure builds. As Alexander's forces move through the land, the experience is not the same everywhere. In some places, resistance is strong. In others, surrender comes more quickly. The vastness of the empire means that each region responds in its own way, shaped by local conditions and leadership. Some researchers question whether Alexander intended to destroy the Persian system or to inherit and adapt it. Evidence suggests that he adopted many elements of Persian administration, even incorporating local customs into his rule. He does not simply replace one structure with another. Instead, he reshapes what already exists. You move through a space that feels caught between worlds. Greek and Persian influences begin to blend in unexpected ways. Language shifts, art changes, clothing reflects new combinations of styles. It is not an immediate transformation but a gradual merging of cultures. A curious detail that often goes unnoticed is how Alexander adopted aspects of Persian royal tradition, including dress and court rituals. This choice was not universally accepted by his own followers, some of whom viewed it as a departure from their own customs, yet it reflects a deeper recognition that the land he now rules cannot be understood through a single perspective. You pause, sensing the complexity of this moment. This is not simply the end of Persia. It is a transition. Archaeologists continue discussing whether the cultural blending that follows Alexander's conquest was widespread or limited to certain regions and elites. Some findings suggest that Greek influence remained concentrated in urban centres, while rural areas retained older traditions. Others point to a more gradual and diffuse exchange that touched many aspects of daily life. The truth, like the landscape around you, is layered. You walk through a city that has changed hands. The architecture still carries Persian forms, but new elements have been added. Columns retook or rise in styles that reflect distant traditions. Public spaces feel both familiar and altered. People move through them with a quiet adaptability, adjusting to new realities while holding on to what they know. You begin to understand that identity does not disappear easily. Even as political control shifts, cultural memory remains. The name Persia, as known to the outside world, will continue to be used. The image of the empire will live on in stories and histories written far away. But within the land itself, something deeper continues, adapting rather than vanishing. You notice how daily life persists. Markets still open, families still gather, work continues. The rhythm of ordinary existence does not stop even as rulers change. This continuity becomes one of the strongest threads in the story, holding the past and present together. Scholars remain divided about how much of the original Persian identity was preserved during this period of Hellenistic influence. Some argue that the changes were profound, reshaping the cultural landscape in lasting ways. Others believe that beneath the surface, Persian traditions remained resilient, ready to re-emerge more clearly in later periods. You take a slow breath, feeling the weight of transition. The air carries both loss and renewal. Something has ended, but something else has begun. The land is not empty of its past, it is full of it even as it changes. The light begins to soften again, and the sounds around you settle into a quieter tone. You feel a sense of movement, not just through space, but through time itself. You realize that this moment is not about disappearance. It is about transformation. The empire that once defined this land has fallen, but the identity beneath it remains shifting, adapting, continuing. You begin to move forward once more. The name Persia will endure in memory. But the story of this land is far from over. You move forward again, and the echoes of conquest begin to settle into something quieter. The presence of Alexander the Great fades into memory, and with it the intense moment of disruption softens into a longer, slower transformation. The land does not feel broken, it feels patient. Time passes, and with it new powers begin to rise from within. A well-established historical fact is that after the fragmentation of Alexander's empire, control over this region eventually shifts to new Iranian dynasties, most notably the Parthians and later the Sasanians. These are not foreign rulers imposing entirely new systems. They are rooted in the land itself, drawing from older traditions, while adapting to a changed world. You begin to sense something familiar returning. The Parthian Empire emerges first shaped by a looser structure than the centralized Achaemenid system. Power is shared among regional leaders, creating a balance that feels less rigid, yet still connected. You walk through a space where authority is present, but not overwhelming. Local rulers hold influence, and the rhythm of life feels closer to the communities themselves. A lesser-known detail is how the Parthians became known for their distinctive style of warfare, particularly their use of mounted archers. Their ability to shoot arrows while retreating, a tactic later called the Parthian shot, allowed them to challenge even powerful enemies in unexpected ways. This method reflects a broader adaptability, a willingness to approach challenges differently. You pause for a moment, watching riders move across open land. There is a sense of fluidity here, a contrast to the more structured systems you encountered earlier. And yet beneath it, the continuity of the land remains. The language, the customs, the deeper cultural threads have not disappeared. They have simply adjusted to new forms of leadership. Some researchers question how unified the Parthian Empire truly was, suggesting that its decentralized nature may have limited its cohesion. Others argue that this flexibility was actually its strength, allowing it to endure by adapting to local conditions rather than imposing strict control. The answer, like much of this history, rests somewhere between. As time continues, you feel another shift approaching. The Sasanian Empire rises with a renewed sense of structure and identity. This time the system feels more deliberate, more focused on restoring something that had been fragmented. There is a conscious effort to reconnect with earlier traditions to bring coherence back to the land. A widely recognized aspect of Sasanian rule is their emphasis on the central authority and cultural revival. They strengthen administrative systems, reinforce boundaries, and promote a shared identity that draws from ancient roots. It feels as though the memory of the Achaemenid past is being reshaped into something new. You walk through a city that reflects this change. The architecture feels more intentional, more symbolic. Public spaces carry a sense of purpose. There is an awareness of history here, not as something distant, but as something actively remembered and reinterpreted. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how the Sasanians invested heavily in infrastructure and urban development. Roads, bridges, and irrigation systems are expanded and maintained, supporting both economic life and administrative control. These improvements are not only practical, they are statements of continuity and renewal. You begin to notice how identity is being expressed more clearly again, not through a single name, but through shared patterns. The use of language, the revival of cultural symbols, the strengthening of traditions. All of these elements contribute to a sense that something distinctly Iranian is re-emerging, even if it's not yet defined in the modern sense. Archaeologists continue discussing whether the Sasanian period represents a direct revival of earlier Persian identity or a new synthesis shaped by centuries of change. Some see strong connections to the Achaemenid past, while others emphasize the innovations and differences that make this era unique. You feel this duality as you move through the space. It is both familiar and new. You pass by a place of worship where rituals are performed with quiet precision. The atmosphere is calm, almost meditative. There is a sense of continuity here that reaches back through generations, linking the present moment to something ancient. Daily life continues around it. People work, trade, and gather as they always have. Children learn by watching those around them. Stories are told, passed from one voice to another. These small acts carry the deeper identity of the land forward even as political structures change. You begin to understand that identity here is not fragile. It does not disappear with the fall of an empire. Instead, it adapts, reshapes itself, and continues beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to become visible again. The light softens and the air grows quieter. You take a slow breath, feeling the steady presence of this enduring culture. It has moved through conquest, through fragmentation, through renewal, and now it stands once more with a sense of balance. Not exactly as it was before, but unmistakably connected to its past. You continue forward, aware that the story is building toward another transformation. The land has remembered itself, and soon it will face a change that reshapes it once again. You continue forward and the atmosphere shifts into something quieter, more inward. The structures of empire still surround you, but your attention is drawn towards something less visible. It is not in the roads or the markets, but in the way people pause, the way they move with a sense of meaning that goes beyond daily survival. There is belief here. You feel it in the stillness of certain spaces, in the careful gestures of those who enter them. A widely accepted historical fact is that one of the earliest and most influential belief systems in this region is Zoroastrianism, traditionally associated with the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster, also known as Zarathustra. This faith emphasizes a cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, light and darkness, order and chaos. You step into a place where a sacred fire burns. It is steady, unwavering, tended with quiet devotion. The flame is not worshipped as a god, but respected as a symbol of purity and truth. The air feels calm, almost suspended, as if time moves differently here. A lesser-known detail is that fire temples were carefully maintained to keep the flame continuously burning, sometimes for generations without interruption. This required constant attention, a quiet discipline passed from one caretaker to the next. The act of preserving the flame becomes a living connection between past and present. You stand nearby feeling the warmth. It is not intense but gentle, consistent, much like the belief itself. Some researchers question exactly when Zoroastrianism first emerged, with estimates ranging across several centuries. The historical record is not entirely clear, and much of what is known comes from later texts and interpretations. Yet its influence is unmistakable, shaping ethical ideas and cultural practices across the region. You begin to notice how this belief system is woven into daily life. It is not confined to temples alone. It appears in small actions, in choices in the way people speak and behave. There is an emphasis on truth, on good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. These ideas are simple yet deeply rooted, guiding behavior in both quiet and visible ways. A curious detail that often escapes attention is how Zoroastrian concepts may have influenced later religious traditions. Ideas such as the final judgment, the existence of heaven and hell, and the role of a moral struggle in human life appear in various forms in other belief systems that developed afterward. While the exact pathways of influence are still being examined, the parallels are striking. You walk through a gathering where people speak softly, their voice is calm and measured. There is a sense of order here that is not imposed from above but accepted from within. Belief shapes behavior, and behavior reinforces belief. It becomes a cycle, steady and self-sustaining. You begin to understand how identity is not only political or cultural, it is also spiritual. Archaeologists continue discussing how widespread Zoroastrian practices were among different social groups. Some evidence suggests that the elite were more closely connected to formal rituals, while rural populations may have followed variations shaped by local traditions. This diversity does not weaken the belief system. It allows it to adapt and remain relevant across different communities. You move further, noticing how symbols appear in subtle ways. Patterns in art, arrangements in architecture. Even the orientation of certain spaces seem to reflect deeper meanings. Nothing feels random. Everything carries a sense of intention. The fire continues to burn behind you, steady and unchanged. You realize that this belief system has endured through multiple empires, through shifts in power and governance. It has not depended on a single ruler or structure. It has lived within people, carried through generations in ways that are both visible and quiet. Scholars remain divided about how much Zoroastrianism shaped the political systems of the empires you have seen. Some argue that its ethical framework influenced leadership and governance. Others believe that practical concerns of power often operated independently of religious ideals. The relationship between belief and authority remains complex, layered, and open to interpretation. You take a slow breath, feeling the calm presence of this spiritual world. It does not demand attention. It simply exists. And in that quiet existence, it shapes the land in ways that are not always immediately visible. You begin to sense how this layer of identity will continue even as new beliefs arrive in the future. It will not disappear completely. It will leave traces, influences, and echoes that remain long after its prominence fades. The light grows softer, and the sounds around you settle into a gentle rhythm. You step away from the fire, carrying with you the sense of balance it represents. Truth and falsehood, light and darkness, order and chaos. These ideas will continue to shape the story of this land even as the names and rulers change. You move forward once more. Another transformation is approaching, and with it a new chapter in the identity of this place begins to unfold. You continue forward, and the calm presence of the fire begins to fade behind you. The air shifts again, carrying something new. It is not immediate or overwhelming. It arrives gradually through voices, through movement, through quiet changes in daily life. At first it is barely noticeable. Then slowly it becomes undeniable. A widely accepted historical fact is that in the 7th century CE, Arab Muslim forces enter the region and bring with them a new belief system, Islam. The Sasanian Empire, already weakened by internal strain and prolonged conflict, begins to lose its hold. What follows is not a single moment of collapse, but a transition that unfolds over time. You walk through a space where two worlds briefly overlap. The older traditions have not disappeared, but something new has begun to take root. You hear unfamiliar words spoken alongside familiar ones. New practices appear subtle at first, then more visible as they spread. A lesser-known detail is that the process of conversion to Islam was often gradual, rather than immediate. Many communities continued their existing practices for generations while slowly integrating new beliefs. This blending creates a layered experience where the past and present exist together, rather than replacing one another all at once. You pause near a place where people gather in quiet reflection. The structure feels different from the fire temples you saw earlier. There is an openness to it, a sense of shared direction. Voices rise in unison, soft yet steady, creating a rhythm that feels both new and familiar. Some researchers question how quickly Islamic influence transformed everyday life in this region. While political control shifted relatively rapidly, cultural and religious changes appear to have taken much longer, unfolding unevenly across different areas. In some places, older traditions remained strong for centuries. In others, new practices were adopted more quickly. You begin to notice how language itself starts to shift. Arabic enters the landscape not only as a language of religion, but also as a language of administration and scholarship. It appears in written texts, in official communication, and in the growing intellectual life of the region. Yet the older Persian language does not vanish. It adapts, absorbing new words and influences while maintaining its core structure. A curious detail that often goes unnoticed is how Persian eventually re-emerges as a major literary language, written in a modified Arabic script. This blending of linguistic forms reflects a deeper pattern of adaptation. Rather than disappearing, Persian reshapes itself within the new cultural environment. You walk through a marketplace listening. The sounds have changed slightly. There is a new cadence in speech, a different rhythm in conversation, and yet the underlying life remains familiar. People still trade, still gather, still move through their days with a quiet sense of purpose. You begin to understand that this transformation is not simply about religion. It is about identity. Archaeologists continue discussing how material culture changed during this period. Some evidence suggests continuity in everyday objects and practices, while other findings point to gradual shifts in our architecture and design. The visible world reflects both persistence and change, a balance that defines this moment in history. You pass by a place where knowledge is being shared. Texts are copied carefully by hand. Ideas are discussed in low, thoughtful voices. There is a sense of intellectual curiosity here, a desire to understand not only the new belief system, but the world itself. This emerging environment will eventually contribute to a broader intellectual movement, one that extends far beyond this region. You feel the quiet expansion of thought. It is not forced. It grows naturally, carried by those who seek understanding. Scholars remain divided about the extent to which the Arab conquest altered the deeper cultural identity of the region. Some argue that it marked a profound transformation, reshaping language, religion, and social structure. Others suggest that beneath these changes, a distinct Persian identity persisted, adapting rather than dissolving. You sense this persistence as you move forward. It is not always visible, but it is present. In the way people speak, in the stories they tell, in the subtle continuity of daily life. The light softens again and the atmosphere becomes calm. You take a slow breath, feeling the blending of past and present around you. The fire temples have given way to new places of worship, but the sense of meaning remains. The language has shifted, but its deeper roots are still there. The structures of power have changed, but the rhythm of life continues. You realize that this moment is not about replacement. It is about transformation through layering. The land does not forget what it was. It carries it forward even as it changes. You continue walking, aware that the story is becoming more complex, more intertwined. The identity of this place is no longer shaped by a single tradition or system. It is becoming something richer, something formed from multiple influences. And somewhere within it, the deeper name of the land continues to wait, not lost, just evolving. You move forward, and the sounds of the new faith settle gently into the background. The transformation you just witnessed does not feel sudden anymore. It feels absorbed, woven into daily life so quietly that it becomes part of the natural rhythm. Something interesting begins to happen here. The name Persia, once tied to a powerful empire, starts to fade from everyday use within the land itself. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but gradually, like a word spoken less often until it slips into memory. A well-established historical observation is that after the Arab conquest, the region becomes integrated into the broader Islamic world, often referred to in administrative and cultural terms that do not emphasize the old imperial name. Instead of Persia as a political identity, the land is understood as part of a wider civilization that stretches across multiple regions, united by religion, trade, and scholarship. You walk through a space where this shift is almost invisible unless you are looking for it. People do not stop being who they were. They continue speaking, working, and living as before. Yet the larger framework around them has changed. The way the world is described, the way regions are categorized, the way identity is expressed in official terms, all begin to move in a different direction. A lesser-known detail is how Persian elites gradually adopted Arabic for administration and intellectual life, especially in the early centuries after the conquest. Many important works in science, philosophy, and theology were written in Arabic, even by scholars of Persian origin. This was not simply a loss of identity, but a strategic adaptation to the dominant cultural and intellectual environment of the time. You begin to notice how identity can shift without disappearing. It becomes quieter, more internal. Some researchers question whether this period represents a decline of Persian identity or a transformation into a more subtle and resilient form. While the visible markers of the old empire become less prominent, deeper cultural elements continue to persist, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. You pass by a gathering where stories are being shared. The language has changed in tone, yet something familiar remains in the rhythm of expression. The themes, the emotions, the ways of understanding the world still carry echoes of an older tradition. It is not gone, it is simply less visible. An interesting detail that often receives little attention is how local traditions and customs continued alongside Islamic practices. In many places, older celebrations, seasonal rituals, and social habits were maintained, sometimes blending with new religious meanings. This layering creates a cultural continuity that is not immediately obvious, but deeply rooted. You pause and listen. There is no sense of loss in the air, only adjustment. Archaeologists continue discussing how this period is reflected in material culture. Some sites show clear continuity in settlement patterns and daily tools, suggesting that ordinary life changed less dramatically than political narratives might imply. Other findings indicate gradual shifts in art and architecture, reflecting new influences while retaining local characteristics. You begin to understand that large historical changes often feel smaller on the ground. Empires rise and fall, names appear and disappear, but daily life moves forward with quiet persistence. You walk past a group of scholars engaged in discussion. Their focus is intense yet calm. They speak of ideas that reach beyond borders, beyond single identities. Knowledge flows more freely now, carried across vast distances through shared language and intellectual exchange. The land you stand in is part of something larger, connected in ways that were not possible before. And yet within that larger world, something distinct remains. Scholars remain divided about how consciously people of this region preserved their cultural identity during this time. Some argue that the blending of influences was so complete that older distinctions became less meaningful. Others believe that a quiet awareness of heritage continued, expressed in language, literature, and tradition, even when not openly emphasized. You feel that quiet awareness now. It is not loud. It does not demand attention, but it is there. The light grows softer and the atmosphere becomes calm once again. You take a slow breath, letting the sense of continuity settle around you. The name Persia may be fading from daily use here, but the essence of what it represented has not vanished. It has gone inward, It has become something carried rather than declared. You continue walking aware that this hidden identity will not remain quiet forever. There will come a moment when it rises again, reshaped by everything it has absorbed. For now, it rests beneath the surface. Waiting, you move forward and the quiet persistence you sensed begins to reveal itself more clearly. What once felt hidden now starts to take shape again, not through power or conquest, but through something softer, something more enduring. Language. You hear it first in fragments. A conversation between two people carries a rhythm that feels older than the structures around them. It is not fully the language of administration, not entirely shaped by recent change. It carries something deeper, something that has survived beneath the surface. A widely accepted historical fact is that the Persian language known today as Farsi re-emerges as a major literary and cultural force around the 9th and 10th centuries, particularly under regional dynasties such as the Samanids. Although Arabic remains dominant in religious and scholarly contexts, Persian begins to flourish again as language of poetry, storytelling, and identity. You begin to feel the shift. Words that once seemed distant now return with clarity. They are written in a new script adapted from Arabic, yet their structure and sound remain distinctly Persian. It is not a return to the past in its original form, but a transformation that carries continuity within change. A lesser-known detail is how deliberately some rulers supported this revival. The Samanid court encouraged the use of Persian in administration and literature, recognizing its importance in connecting with local populations. This support allows the language to grow not only as a means of communication, but as a symbol of cultural resilience. You walk into a space where poetry is being recited. The voices are calm, measured, almost musical. Each word flows into the next, creating a rhythm that feels both soothing and profound. The listeners are attentive not because they are required to be, but because the language itself carries meaning beyond the surface. Some researchers question whether this revival was a conscious effort to preserve identity, or simply a natural evolution of language within changing political conditions. While patronage from local rulers clearly played a role, the deeper attachment people felt to their language may have been just as important. You begin to understand that language is more than a tool, it is memory. A curious detail that often goes unnoticed is how Persian literature during this period begins to reconnect with pre-Islamic themes and stories. Epic tales, historical narratives, and cultural motifs that trace back to earlier eras are woven into new works. This creates a bridge between the past and present, allowing older identities to reappear in a form that fits the current world. You pause as a storyteller begins to speak. The story reaches back into a time you have already visited. Kings, heroes, and events from long ago are brought to life once more. They are not presented as distant history, but as something still relevant, still part of the living culture. You feel the continuity. It is no longer hidden. Archaeologists continue discussing how widespread literacy and literary culture were during this revival. While courts and urban centres clearly played a central role, it is less certain how deeply these developments reached into rural areas. Even so, the influence of these works spreads, gradually shaping identity across different levels of society. You walk through a city where written words appear more frequently. Inscriptions, manuscripts, and records carry the language forward. It is visible now, present in a way that it had not been for some time, and with that visibility comes a renewed sense of identity. You begin to notice how people respond to it. There is a quiet pride, a recognition of something familiar returning. It does not replace the broader Islamic culture that surrounds it. Instead, it exists within it, adding another layer to the complex identity of the region. Scholars remain divided about how much of this literary revival reflects continuity with ancient Persian traditions versus new creations inspired by current conditions. Some see strong connections to earlier forms, while others emphasize the innovation and adaptation that define this period. You sense both at once. It is old and new, familiar and transformed. The light around you softens and the atmosphere becomes calm again. The sounds of the city blend into a gentle rhythm, and the words you hear carry a sense of stability as though they have found their place once more. You take a slow breath. The name Persia may not yet have returned in full, but something just as important has. The voice of the land. You continue walking, aware that this revival is only the beginning of a deeper reawakening. The identity that once seemed quiet and internal is now finding ways to express itself again through language, through stories, through shared memory. And with each word spoken, it becomes stronger. You move forward, and the return of language begins to open into something even wider. The voices you heard earlier, the poetry, the quiet rhythm of storytelling now expand into a broader world of thought. It is no longer only about preserving identity, it is about shaping knowledge itself. You step into a space filled with ideas. A widely accepted historical fact is that during what is often called the Islamic Golden Age, roughly between the 8th and 13th centuries, scholars from across the Islamic world made significant contributions to science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. Among them, many were of Persian origin, playing a central role in this intellectual flourishing. You feel the atmosphere change. There is a sense of curiosity here, a quiet energy that comes not from conflict or conquest, but from inquiry. People gather not to trade goods alone, but to exchange ideas. Books are copied, studied, discussed. Knowledge moves across regions just as easily as goods once did along the empire's roads. A lesser-known detail is how Persian scholars often worked within a shared intellectual environment that used Arabic as its primary language while still carrying their own cultural perspectives into their work. This blending allowed ideas to travel widely, while also preserving subtle distinctions in thought and approach. You walk past a group engaged in careful discussion. One speaks of the movement of stars, another considers the nature of the human body. A third reflects on the meaning of existence itself. Their voices are calm, measured, patient. There is no urgency here, only a steady pursuit of understanding. Some researchers question how much of this intellectual development can be attributed specifically to Persian influence as opposed to the broader environment of the Islamic world. While it is clear that scholars from many regions contributed, the role of Persian thinkers remains deeply significant in shaping the direction and depth of these fields. You begin to notice how knowledge connects people across distances. Ideas travel from one city to another, carried by scholars, merchants, and travellers. A discovery made in one place is discussed in another, refined, expanded, and shared again. The land you are walking through becomes part of a vast network of learning. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how institutions such as libraries and centres of learning developed during this time, providing spaces where knowledge could be collected and preserved. These places are not only repositories of information, but environments where ideas can grow. You pause near one such place. Inside shelves hold manuscripts carefully arranged. The air is quiet, filled with the soft sound of pages turning. A scholar leans over a text, tracing lines with careful attention. Another writes slowly, preserving what has been learned for those who will come later. You feel the continuity again, not just of identity, but of thought. Archaeologists continue discussing how widely access to knowledge extended beyond elite circles. While major centres of learning were clearly hubs of intellectual activity, it is less certain how deeply this culture of scholarship reached into everyday life. Even so, its influence spreads gradually, shaping education culture and values across the region. You step back into the open air. The world outside feels connected to what you have just seen. Conversations carry hints of deeper ideas. Even ordinary interactions seem shaped by a broader awareness of knowledge and inquiry. You begin to understand that identity here is not only preserved through memory, it's expanded through understanding. Scholars remain divided about how this period influenced the later development of European thought, with some arguing that the transmission of knowledge through translation played a crucial role, while others emphasize parallel developments in different regions. What is clear is that the intellectual work done here does not remain isolated. It travels, influencing worlds far beyond its origin. The light softens again and the atmosphere becomes calm. You take a slow breath, letting the sense of quiet discovery settle around you. The land you walk through is no longer defined only by its past. It is actively shaping the future, contributing to a wider world of ideas and knowledge. And within this broader movement, something distinctly Persian continues to exist. Not always visible, not always named, but present in the way ideas are approached, in the balance between tradition and curiosity, in the quiet persistence of cultural identity. You continue forward and aware that this intellectual flowering is part of a larger process. The land is not only remembering itself, it is redefining itself, and soon that identity will begin to take on a clearer form once more. You continue forward and the quiet world of scholarship begins to blend with something more familiar. The ideas, the books, the conversations you just witnessed do not remain confined to scholars alone. They begin to flow outward, shaping culture in ways that feel more visible, more personal. You sense a return, not sudden, not loud, but steady. A broadly accepted historical reality is that from around the 10th century onward, Persian cultural identity experiences a strong revival, particularly through literature, art, and court life. Regional dynasties support this resurgence, allowing Persian traditions to express themselves more openly again within the wider Islamic world. You walk into a gathering where stories are no longer only preserved, they are celebrated. A voice rises, reciting lines that carry both elegance and depth. The language feels rich, layered with meaning. It is not only communication, it is expression. It is memory shaped into form. A lesser-known detail is how epic poetry plays a central role in this revival, especially through works like the Shahnameh, composed by Ferdowsi. This monumental text retells the history and legends of ancient Iran, preserving stories that reach back to pre-Islamic times. It becomes more than literature. It becomes a cultural anchor. You listen as the names of kings and heroes are spoken again. They feel familiar as if they have never truly left. Some researchers question whether this revival represents a deliberate effort to reconnect with pre-Islamic identity or a natural cultural evolution within changing political conditions. While patronage from rulers clearly supports it, the deep emotional resonance of these stories suggests that they were already present within the collective memory. You begin to notice how identity is now expressed openly again. It's no longer hidden beneath layers of adaptation. It speaks through art, through poetry, through shared cultural references that connect people across regions. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how Persian becomes a prestigious language across many parts of the Islamic world, not only within this land. Courts in distant regions adopt it for literature and administration, spreading its influence far beyond its original boundaries. This expansion reflects both its beauty and its cultural significance. You walk through a space where artisans are at work. Patterns emerge on fabric, on walls, on objects shaped by careful hands. The designs carry a sense of continuity, reflecting motifs that have evolved over time yet remain connected to older traditions. Nothing feels isolated. Everything feels part of a larger story. You begin to understand how culture moves differently from power. It does not conquer, it spreads. Archaeologists continue discussing how this cultural revival is reflected in everyday life. While elite circles clearly embrace and promote Persian traditions, it is less certain how uniformly these changes reach rural communities. Yet even in smaller spaces, traces of this revival appear, suggesting a gradual and widespread influence. You pause near a group of listeners gathered around a storyteller. Their attention is calm, focused. They are not simply hearing a story, they are reconnecting with something deeper. The past is not distant here. It is present, woven into the fabric of the moment. You feel a quiet sense of recognition. The identity that once seemed hidden has found its voice again. Scholars remain divided about how much of this revival reshaped the long-term identity of the region versus reinforcing what had always existed beneath the surface. Some argue that it marks a turning point, creating a clearer distinction between Persian and broader Islamic identities. Others believe it reveals continuity rather than change, bringing into view something that never fully disappeared. You sense both perspectives as you move through the space. It is both rediscovery and continuation. The light around you softens and the atmosphere becomes calm once more. The sounds of poetry, of conversation, of quiet creation blend into a gentle rhythm. There is a sense of balance here, as though the land has found a way to hold multiple layers of identity without conflict. You take a slow breath. The name Persia may still be more familiar to the outside world, but within the land something deeper is becoming clearer. A sense of self that does not depend on external labels but on shared memory, language, and expression. You continue walking, aware that this renewed identity will soon take on an even more defined form. The story is moving toward a moment where culture and power will align once again, and when they do, the shape of this land will become clearer than ever before. You continue forward, and the quiet cultural revival you have been sensing begins to gather strength. What once lived in poetry and memory and language now starts to move into the structure of power itself. Something is aligning. A broadly accepted historical reality is that in the early 16th century a new dynasty rises and reshapes the region in a decisive way. The Safavid Empire establishes control and begins to unify large parts of the land under a single authority. For the first time in centuries, political power and cultural identity begin to move together again. You feel the shift immediately. This is not only governance. It is definition. You walk into a city that carries a new sense of purpose. The streets feel more organized, the structures more intentional. There is a visible effort to shape not just how people live, but how they understand themselves as part of something larger. A lesser-known detail is how the Safavid rulers actively promoted a shared identity through art, architecture, and public life. They supported the construction of grand mosques, public squares, and urban spaces that reflected a distinct aesthetic. These places were not only functional, they were symbolic, expressing a unified vision of the land. You stand in a wide open square. The space feels deliberate, designed to bring people together. The surrounding buildings create a sense of harmony, their forms echoing one another. It is not overwhelming, it is balanced. You begin to notice how identity is being shaped in visible ways, not hidden in language alone, not carried quietly through stories, but expressed openly through the environment itself. Some researchers question whether this unification was driven more by political necessity or by a genuine effort to create a cohesive identity. While the Safavid rulers clearly needed to consolidate power, the depth of cultural investment suggests that something more was at work. The creation of a shared identity became part of the foundation of stability. You walk through a place where artisans are at work on detailed designs. Patterns flow across surfaces with precision and care. Colours are chosen thoughtfully. Every element seems to contribute to a larger whole. There is a sense that beauty itself is part of the identity being formed. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how the Safavid capital, particularly cities like Isfahan, becomes a centre of artistic and architectural innovation. These cities are not only administrative hubs, they are cultural statements designed to reflect the strength and unity of the state. You pause, taking in the atmosphere. There is a quiet confidence here, similar to what you felt earlier in the Achaemenid period, yet different in tone. This is not a return to the past. It is a reinterpretation shaped by everything that has come in between. You begin to sense how the idea of Iran is becoming more defined, not just as a cultural memory, but as a lived reality. Archaeologists continue discussing how deeply this new identity reached into all levels of society. While urban centres clearly reflect the Safavid vision, it is less certain how uniformly this identity was experienced in rural areas. Even so, the influence of centralised power begins to create a more consistent sense of belonging across the region. You walk past a group of people gathered in conversation. Their voices carry a shared understanding, a sense that they are part of something defined and recognised. It is not only about where they live, it is about who they are within a larger framework. You feel the clarity growing. The layers of identity that once existed quietly side by side are now being brought together. Scholars remain divided about how much of this transformation was a continuation of earlier Persian identity versus a new construction shaped by Safavid policies. Some see strong continuity pointing to language and cultural traditions that had already been revived. Others emphasize the role of political power in solidifying and redefining that identity. You sense both elements again. It is continuity shaped by intention. The light softens and the atmosphere becomes calm once more. You take a slow breath, letting the sense of unity settle around you. The land you're walking through now feels more cohesive, more clearly defined than before. You realize that this is a turning point, not just in politics, but in identity itself. The story that began with scattered communities that moved through empires, conquests, and quiet revivals is now forming into something more recognizable. Something that will soon carry a name the world has not fully understood yet. You continue forward, aware that this new identity is still unfolding. It is not complete, but it is stronger than ever. You move forward and the unity you sense begins to deepen into something more specific, more defining. The structures of power are now closely tied to belief, and that belief is not simply a private matter. It shapes the direction of the entire land. You begin to feel a clear distinction forming. A broadly accepted historical reality is that under the Safavid Empire, Twelver Shia Islam is established as the official state religion. This decision sets the region apart from many of its neighbours, most of whom follow Sunni Islam. What was once a shared religious framework across much of the Islamic world now becomes a point of difference. You walk into a gathering where this identity is expressed. The atmosphere feels familiar in its calm yet different in tone. There is a deeper emphasis on certain figures, certain stories, certain interpretations that carry emotional weight. The rituals are not only acts of faith, they are expressions of belonging. A lesser-known detail is how the Safavid rulers actively encouraged the spread of Shia scholarship by inviting religious scholars from other regions and supporting the development of institutions that could teach and reinforce this belief system. This was not an organic shift alone. It was guided, structured, and sustained over time. You begin to notice how belief becomes a boundary, not in a harsh or visible way, but in a quiet sense of distinction. It shapes how people understand themselves in relation to others. It gives the land a unique identity within a broader world that once felt more unified. Some researchers question how quickly the population adopted Shia Islam, and to what extent it was accepted versus encouraged through state influence. While official policy played a strong role, the process appears to have been gradual, with variations across different regions and communities. You feel that gradual change as you move through different spaces. In one place, the practices feel firmly established, deeply rooted in daily life. In another, they feel newer, still taking shape. This unevenness reflects the complexity of transformation, showing how identity evolves at different speeds depending on local conditions. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how religious rituals during this period take on a strong communal aspect. Gatherings, processions, and shared acts of remembrance bring people together, reinforcing a sense of unity. These moments are not only spiritual, they are social, creating bonds that extend beyond individual belief. You pause near a group participating in such a gathering. Their movements are coordinated, their voices rising and falling together. There is a sense of connection here that goes beyond words. It is felt in the rhythm, in the shared experience, in the quiet understanding that they are part of something larger than themselves. You begin to understand how identity is now being reinforced from multiple directions, through language, through culture, and now through belief. Archaeologists continue discussing how this religious transformation influenced everyday life beyond formal rituals. Some evidence suggests changes in architecture and the layout of cities and in the design of public spaces. Other findings point to more subtle shifts in social behaviour and community structure. The influence of belief extends into many aspects of life even when not immediately visible. You walk through a neighbourhood where these influences can be seen. Certain spaces are arranged differently. Certain practices are observed with quiet consistency. There is a sense of order that reflects not only governance but shared values. You feel the identity becoming more defined, not just internally but in contrast to others. Scholars remain divided about whether the adoption of Shia Islam was the most decisive factor in shaping what would later become modern Iranian identity. Some argue that it created a lasting distinction that continues to influence the region today. Others suggest that it was one of several important elements interacting with language, culture, and history in complex ways. You sense how all of these elements come together. None of them alone defines the land, but together they create something unique. The light softens again and the atmosphere becomes calm. You take a slow breath, letting the sense of shared belief settle around you. The land you are walking through now feels not only unified, but distinct, marked by a combination of factors that set it apart. You realize that this distinction will carry forward. It will shape how this land is seen, how it is understood, and how it understands itself. You continue walking, aware that the identity forming here is becoming clearer, more visible, more defined with each passing moment. The story is moving closer to the present now, and the name that has been quietly waiting will soon step into the light. You continue forward, and the sense of unity is shaped by belief now meets a new kind of pressure. The land feels defined from within and yet surrounded by forces that test that identity from the outside. You begin to notice the edges. A broadly accepted historical reality is that during the Safavid period, this region finds itself positioned between two powerful neighbours, the Ottoman Empire to the west and various Central Asian forces to the east. These surrounding powers do not simply exist at a distance. They press against the borders, creating a constant need for defence, negotiation and adaptation. You walk along a frontier where the land feels more alert. The calm rhythm of internal life continues, but there is an added awareness here. Movement is watched more carefully. Decisions carry greater weight. The identity that has been forming is now being tested by interaction with others who follow different paths. A lesser-known detail is how these encounters are not limited to conflict. Trade diplomacy and cultural exchange also take place across these boundaries. Goods move between regions. Ideas travel with them. Even in moments of tension, there are connections that link these worlds together. You pause as a group of travellers passes by. Their clothing suggests origins from different regions. Their language carries unfamiliar tones, and yet they move through this space with a quiet understanding of shared roots and mutual needs. The boundaries between worlds are real but not absolute. Some researchers question how much these external pressures strengthened internal identity. Facing powerful neighbours may have encouraged a clearer sense of unity within reinforcing distinctions that might otherwise have remained less defined. At the same time, constant interaction also introduced new influences, creating a balance between separation and exchange. You begin to feel this balance as you move forward. The land does not close itself off. It engages. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how border regions develop their own unique character. These areas, shaped by a repeated interaction with different cultures, often blend elements from both sides. Language, clothing, and customs can reflect them, mixing, creating spaces that feel both connected and distinct at the same time. You walk through one such place. The atmosphere feels slightly different. There is a familiarity in some aspects, yet subtle variations in others. It is not confusion, it is adaptation. People here are used to navigating between worlds, understanding differences without losing their own sense of identity. You begin to understand how identity is not only shaped from within, it's also defined through contrast. Archaeologists continue discussing how these interactions are reflected in material culture. Artifacts found in border regions often show influences from multiple traditions, suggesting ongoing exchange even during periods of political tension. These findings reveal a more complex picture than simple division. You move along a path that follows the edge of this interaction. The land stretches out in both directions, each side carrying its own history, its own identity. And yet they meet here, influencing one another in ways that are not always visible at first glance. You feel a quiet awareness growing. This land knows itself more clearly now, not only because of its internal development, but because it exists alongside others who are different. The presence of those differences sharpens its sense of self. Scholars remain divided about whether these external pressures primarily strengthened or challenged the emerging identity of this region. Some argue that constant conflict created resilience and unity. Others suggest that the ongoing need to respond to outside forces introduced instability and change. Both perspectives reveal different aspects of the same experience. You sense both as you continue walking. There is strength here, but also adaptation. The light softens once again and the atmosphere returns to a calm rhythm. The sounds of movement, of conversation, of daily life continue steady and unbroken. Despite the pressures at its borders, the land maintains its balance. You take a slow breath. The identity forming here is no longer fragile. It has been shaped by history, by belief, by culture, and now by interaction with the wider world. It is aware of itself, aware of others, and capable of holding that awareness without losing its core. You continue forward knowing that the story is moving into a new phase. The land has defined itself. Now it will begin to change again, not through loss, but through transformation shaped by a different kind of influence. You move forward, and the tension of borders begins to soften into something more internal again. The land feels stable, yet there is a quiet sense that change is coming from within, not from distant empires, but from shifting ideas about how life could be organized. You begin to notice small adjustments. A broadly accepted historical reality is that during the 18th and 19th centuries, this region still widely known to the outside world as Persia begins to encounter new concepts of governance technology and modernization, especially through increasing contact with European powers. These ideas do not arrive all at once. They appear gradually, often unevenly, entering through trade diplomacy and observation. You walk through a city where traditional rhythms continue, yet subtle differences emerge. Clothing remains familiar, architecture still reflects older patterns, but there are new objects, new tools, new ways of organizing space. They do not replace what came before. They sit alongside it quietly, introducing new possibilities. A lesser-known detail is how early efforts at modernization often focused on military reform. Leaders recognized that in order to maintain independence, they needed to understand and adapt certain techniques from Europe. This included reorganizing armies, introducing new forms of training, and adopting different technologies. These changes were not always smooth, but they marked the beginning of a broader transformation. You pause near a group observing a demonstration. There is curiosity in their expression mixed with uncertainty. The new methods are not rejected, but neither are they fully embraced. They are examined, tested, considered. Some researchers question how deeply these early reforms affected everyday life at this stage. While changes in military and administrative structures are clear, their impact on ordinary people appears to have been more gradual, often limited to urban centres or specific groups. You begin to feel this unevenness as you move. In one part of the city, life continues almost unchanged. In another, there are signs of new organisation, new ideas shaping the way things are done. The contrast is subtle but present. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how exposure to foreign ideas also leads to a growing awareness of difference. People begin to compare systems to notice how other societies function and to question what might be possible within their own. This awareness does not immediately lead to change, but it plants a seed. You walk through a space where discussion is taking place. Voices are calm but thoughtful. There is a sense that something is being considered carefully. Not everything from outside is accepted, but not everything is dismissed either. There is a process of selection, of adaptation, of trying to understand what fits and what does not. You begin to understand how modernization does not arrive as a single event. It unfolds slowly. Archaeologists continue discussing how material culture reflects this period of transition. Imported goods appear alongside traditional ones. New construction techniques begin to emerge in certain areas. Yet older forms remain dominant in many places, creating a layered environment where past and present coexist. You walk along a street where this layering is visible. A building reflects older design, while nearby another shows signs of new influence. People move between them without hesitation, as though both belong equally to their world. You feel the balance. It's not a rejection of the past. It is not a full embrace of the new. It is something in between. Scholars remain divided about whether these early modernization efforts were driven more by necessity or by a genuine desire for transformation. Some argue that external pressure made change unavoidable, while others suggest that internal curiosity and ambition also played a significant role. You sense both as you continue. There is pressure from outside. but also a growing awareness within. The light softens once again and the atmosphere becomes calm. The sounds of the city settle into a steady rhythm, familiar yet slightly altered. You take a slow breath, letting the sense of transition settle around you. The land you walk through is not the same as it was before, but it is not entirely different. Different either. It is changing in ways that are careful, measured, and still unfolding. You continue forward, aware that these early shifts will lead to something more visible, more defined. The quiet adjustments you see now will eventually shape larger movements, ones that will redefine how this land understands itself. The story is moving closer to a moment where change can no longer remain subtle, and when that moment arrives, the identity of this land will be tested once again. You continue forward, and the quiet adjustments you notice begin to deepen into something more complex. The changes are no longer only about curiosity or gradual adaptation. There is another force at work now, one that's less visible but deeply influential. You begin to feel it in the background. A broadly accepted historical reality is that during the 19th and early 20th centuries, foreign powers, particularly the British and Russian empires, begin to exert significant influence over Persia's economy and politics. This influence does not always appear as direct control. Instead, it often takes the form of agreements, concessions, and financial arrangements that shape decisions from behind the scenes. You walk through a space where this influence is difficult to see at first. Life continues as it always has. Markets are active, conversations flow, yet beneath the surface, decisions are being made that affect the direction of the land in ways that are not immediately visible to those living within it. A lesser-known detail is how economic concessions play a major role in this process. Foreign companies are granted rights to develop resources, build infrastructure, or manage certain industries. While these agreements often promise development, they can also limit local control over important aspects of the economy. You begin to notice how power can operate quietly, not through armies or visible authority, but through agreements that shape outcomes over time. Some researchers question how much agency local leaders had in these arrangements. While external pressure was strong, there were also internal decisions, negotiations, and compromises that contributed to the situation. The balance between external influence and internal responsibility remains a subject of ongoing discussion. You move through a gathering where people speak in lower tones. There is a sense of awareness here, a recognition that something is changing even if it is not fully understood. Concerns are expressed carefully, not loudly, but with a quiet seriousness. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how the discovery and growing importance of oil begins to transform the strategic value of this land. What was once primarily significant for its location and history now becomes increasingly important for its natural resources. This adds another layer to foreign interest, deepening her involvement in ways that extend beyond simple trade. You pause, sensing the weight of this realization. The land is no longer only shaping its own path. Others are shaping it as well. Archaeologists continue discussing how these changes are reflected in infrastructure and material culture. Railways, telegraph lines, and new forms of construction begin to appear, often linked to foreign investment. These developments bring new capabilities but also new dependencies, tying the land more closely to external systems. You walk along a path where these changes are visible. A new structure stands beside an older one. A line of communication stretches across the landscape, connecting distant points with unfamiliar speed. These are signs of progress, yet they also carry a sense of imbalance. You begin to understand how modernization and influence can become intertwined. What appears as advancement may also bring new forms of control. Scholars remain divided about whether this period should be seen primarily as one of exploitation or of complex interaction. Some emphasize the unequal nature of these relationships, pointing to the loss of economic independence. Others highlight the introduction of new technologies and connections that would later play a role in further development. You sense both perspectives as you move forward. There is benefit, but also constraint. The light softens again and the atmosphere becomes calm, though now it carries a subtle tension beneath it. You take a slow breath, feeling the complexity of this moment. The identity of this land is no longer shaped only by its own history and choices. It is being influenced by forces beyond its borders, and yet even within this situation, something remains steady. The deeper sense of identity you have been following has not disappeared. It continues quietly present in language, in culture, in the way people understand themselves. You continue walking aware that this tension cannot remain unresolved. The quiet influence you feel now will eventually lead to a response. And when that response comes, it will mark a new turning point in the story. You move forward and the quiet tension you sense begins to gather into something more visible. It no longer remains hidden in agreements or distant decisions. It rises slowly into the awareness of ordinary people shaping conversations, expectations, and eventually action. You begin to feel a shift in the air. A well-established historical fact is that in the early 20th century, Persia experiences the constitutional revolution, a movement that seeks to limit the absolute power of the monarchy and introduce a system of law and representation. For the first time in this long journey, the idea of shared political authority begins to take form in a more formal and structured way. You walk into a space where people are gathered with purpose. Their voices are calm but firm. There is a sense that something important is being discussed, something that affects not only the present but the future. This is not a moment of sudden upheaval. It is the result of years of growing awareness of quiet dissatisfaction that has finally found expression. A lesser-known detail is how merchants, scholars, and religious figures all play roles in this movement. It is not confined to a single group. Different parts of society come together, each bringing their own concerns and perspectives. This diversity gives the movement strength but also complexity. You begin to notice how ideas move through the crowd. Concepts like law, fairness, and accountability are spoken with care. They are not entirely new, but they are being expressed in new ways connected to a vision of how governance might function differently. Some researchers question how unified the goals of the constitutional revolution truly were. While there was broad agreement on limiting power, different groups envisioned different outcomes. Some sought reform within existing structures, while others imagined more fundamental changes. You feel this range of perspectives as you move among them. There is agreement, but also variation. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how written documents and printed materials play a growing role during this period. Newspapers, pamphlets, and public writings help spread ideas more widely than before, allowing discussions to reach beyond immediate gatherings. Information begins to move more freely, shaping awareness across different regions. You pause near a place where such materials are being read aloud. Listeners gather attentive and thoughtful. The words carry weight not because they are imposed, but because they resonate. People are beginning to see themselves not only as subjects, but as participants in the shaping of their society. You begin to understand how identity is evolving again. It's no longer only cultural or religious. It is becoming political. Archaeologists continue discussing how the physical spaces of cities reflect this change. Meeting places, public squares, and centers of discussion become more active, serving as locations where ideas are exchanged and collective decisions begin to form. These spaces take on new meaning, becoming part of the process of transformation. You walk through one of these areas. The atmosphere feels focused yet calm. There is no chaos, no overwhelming noise. Instead, there is a steady presence of thought, of conversation, of people engaging with one another in ways that feel purposeful. You sense the importance of this moment. For the first time, the question of how this land should be governed is being explored openly. Scholars remain divided about how lasting the immediate effects of the constitutional revolution were. While it introduced new structures and ideas, the stability of these changes faced challenges in the years that followed. Some view it as a foundational moment that planted seeds for future developments, while others emphasize the difficulties in sustaining its outcomes. You feel both the hope and the uncertainty as you continue. There is progress, but also fragility. The light softens and the atmosphere becomes calm once more. You take a slow breath, letting the sense of possibility settle around you. The land you walk through is no longer only shaped by tradition or external influence. It's beginning to shape itself in new ways. You realize that this moment is not the end of change. It is the beginning of a new kind of transformation, one that will continue to unfold, influenced by both internal aspirations and external pressures. You continue forward aware that the identity of this land is becoming more complex, more layered, more conscious of itself. And soon that awareness will lead to decisions that reshape not only how the land is governed, but how it is named. You move forward, and the energy of reform you just witnessed begins to settle into something more directed. The discussions, the ideas, the attempts to reshape governance do not disappear. Instead, they create a path for a new kind of leadership to emerge. You begin to sense a stronger hand guiding change. A well-established historical fact is that in the early 20th century, Reza Shah rises to power and begins a series of reforms aimed at transforming Persia into a more centralized and modern nation. His approach is different from the earlier movements you observed. It is less about collective debate and more about decisive action. You walk into a city that feels more structured than before. There is a clear sense of order of planning. Roads are expanded. New buildings appear with different designs reflecting influences from outside while maintaining local elements. The pace of change feels faster now, more deliberate. A lesser-known detail is how Reza Shah places strong emphasis on creating a unified national identity. He promotes the use of a common language, strengthens central authority, and works to reduce the influence of regional and tribal divisions. These efforts are intended to bring coherence to a land that has long balanced diversity with unity. You begin to notice how identity is being shaped more directly, not only through culture or belief, but through policy. Some researchers question whether these reforms were primarily beneficial or whether they came at the cost of suppressing certain traditions. While modernization brings new opportunities and infrastructure, it also involves changes that not everyone experiences in the same way. The balance between progress and preservation becomes a central tension. You feel this tension as you move through different spaces. In one area, the changes are welcome, seen as a step towards stability and strength. In another, there is quiet resistance, a sense that something familiar is being altered too quickly. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how clothing and public appearance become part of this transformation. New standards are introduced, encouraging a more uniform and modern look. These changes are visible, shaping how people present themselves and how they are perceived within society. You pause, observing the contrast. Older styles still exist, carried by those who hold on to tradition. New forms appear alongside them, representing a shift toward a different vision of identity. The coexistence of these elements reflects a society in transition. You begin to understand how modernization is not only about infrastructure or governance. It is about perception. Archaeologists continue discussing how these reforms are reflected in the physical landscape. Urban planning becomes more organized. Public institutions are expanded. New forms of education are introduced. These changes reshape not only how people live, but how they interact with their environment. You walk past a school where students are gathered. There is a sense of structure here, of learning, guided by new systems. The knowledge being shared connects the past with the present, preparing for a future that is still taking shape. You feel the forward momentum. It is steady, purposeful. Scholars remain divided about how much of this transformation was driven by internal vision versus external influence. Some see Reza Shah's reforms as a continuation of earlier modernization efforts shaped by both local needs and global trends. Others emphasize the role of strong centralized authority in pushing these changes forward. You sense both elements as you continue. There is intention and there is influence. The light softens again and the atmosphere becomes calm. You take a slow breath, letting the sense of transformation settle around you. The land you are walking through is no longer only responding to change. It is actively shaping itself, guided by a vision of what it could become. You realize that this moment is leading towards something significant, a decision that will affect not only how the land functions, but how it is known to the world. The name that has existed quietly for centuries is about to step into the foreground, and when it does, it will change how this land is seen both from within and beyond its borders. You continue forward aware that the next step in this journey will bring that hidden identity into clear view. You continue forward and the sense of direction you felt under new leadership begins to narrow into a single deliberate decision. The reforms, the restructuring, the effort to shape identity all seem to be leading toward this moment. A moment of naming. A well-established historical fact is that in 1935, under Reza Shah, the country officially requests that foreign nations refer to it as Iran rather than Persia. What had long been an internal name used by its own people for centuries is now brought into the global conversation. You feel the quiet weight of this shift. It is not a change of land, not a change of people, but a change of how the world is asked to see it. You walk through a space where this announcement is being understood in different ways. For some, it feels natural, almost overdue. The name Iran has always existed here, carried through language, tradition and memory. Now it is simply being recognized more widely. For others, the change feels more uncertain. The name Persia has long been associated with history, art and empire in the outside world. It carries familiarity, a sense of recognition built over centuries. Replacing it does not erase that past, but it does shift the way it is presented. A lesser-known detail is the request to adopt the name Iran was connected to a broader effort to emphasize national identity and unity. By using a name rooted in ancient heritage, the leadership sought to reinforce a sense of continuity that reached beyond more recent historical layers. You begin to notice how names shape perception. They guide how to They influence what is remembered. Some researchers question whether the timing of this change was influenced by global trends of nationalism during the early 20th century. Many countries were redefining themselves, emphasizing internal identity over externally assigned labels. Within this context, the adoption of the name Iran can be seen as part of a wider movement. You pause considering how this moment fits into the long journey you have followed. The name Iran is not new. It is ancient, yet for the world beyond this land it feels like a transformation. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how the name Iran itself comes from the term Aryanam, meaning of the Aryans, a word that originally referred to a broad cultural and linguistic group in ancient times. In its original context, it carried no political meaning as it would later acquire elsewhere. Here it simply reflected a shared heritage. You walk through a gathering where people speak of the change. Their reactions are calm, thoughtful. Some use the new name with ease. Others continue to use older terms out of habit. There is no sudden break. Instead, there is a gradual adjustment, a process of becoming familiar with how the land is now presented. You begin to understand that identity does not shift instantly with a single decision. It settles over time. Archaeologists continue discussing how such changes in naming are reflected in material culture. Documents, inscriptions, and official records begin to adopt the name Iran more consistently, while older references to Persia remain present in certain contexts. This overlap creates a transitional period where both names coexist. You walk along a path where signs of both can be seen. One inscription reflects the newer identity, another carries the older name. They do not contradict each other. They coexist. You feel the continuity again. The land has not changed, only the lens through which it is viewed. Scholars remain divided about how much this name change altered the deeper identity of the country. Some argue that it primarily affected international perception, leaving internal identity largely unchanged. Others suggest that it reinforced a more unified national consciousness, giving greater visibility to a name that had always existed. You sense both interpretations as you continue. The change is both symbolic and practical. It affects as how the world speaks, and how the land speaks of itself. The light softens once more and the atmosphere becomes calm. You take a slow breath, letting the meaning of this moment settle around you. The name Persia does not disappear. It remains in history and art in memory. But now alongside it, the name Iran stands clearly, openly recognized not only within the land, but beyond it. You continue walking, aware that this moment marks a turning point. The hidden identity has stepped into the light, And from here, the story will move into a world where that identity must navigate new challenges, new pressures, and new understandings. You move forward and the name that has just emerged begins to unfold in meaning. It is no longer only a decision or a declaration. It is a word carrying centuries within it, quiet layers that reach far deeper than its modern use. You begin to ask what it truly means. A widely recognized historical insight is that the word Iran originates from an ancient term often translated as Land of the Aryans, a phrase rooted in early Indo-Iranian identity. In its original context, it described a cultural and linguistic group rather than a political state. It was not a label imposed from outside, but one that grew from within, shaped by shared heritage. You stand with that idea for a moment. It feels older than any empire you've seen, older than Persia as the world remembers it. A lesser-known detail is how the term Iran appears in ancient texts in forms such as Iran or Aryanam, used to describe both people and place. These references suggest that the concept of Iran existed long before it was formally adopted as the name of a modern country. It lived quietly in language, waiting to be brought forward. You begin to sense how this name connects distant moments. It links the early movements of Indo-Iranian peoples to the cultural revival you witnessed centuries later. It ties together language, belief and memory into a single thread that runs through the entire story. Some researchers question how directly the ancient concept of Iran relates to the modern nation. While the linguistic connection is clear, the political and cultural realities have changed significantly over time. The meaning of the word has evolved, shaped by history, rather than remaining fixed. You feel that evolution as you move through the space. The name is ancient, but its meaning is layered. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how the adoption of the name Iran in the 20th century can be seen as a reactivation of this deeper identity, rather than the creation of something new. It is not a break from the past. It is a return to a term that had always existed beneath the surface. You walk through a place where this layered meaning becomes visible. Symbols, language, and cultural expressions all carry traces of continuity. They reflect a long history of adaptation where identity is not replaced but reshaped and carried forward. You begin to understand that names are not only labels, they are stories. Archaeologists continue discussing how the idea of Iran is reflected in ancient inscriptions and artifacts. While the term itself appears in certain contexts, its interpretation varies depending on the source. Some evidence points to a clear cultural identity, while other findings suggest a broader, more fluid concept. You pause considering how this ambiguity adds depth rather than confusion. The name Iran does not belong to a single moment. It belongs to many. You feel the weight of that continuity. It is not heavy. It is steady. Scholars remain divided about how much the modern use of the name Iran has reshaped historical understanding. Some argue that it helps reconnect the present with ancient roots, offering a clearer sense of continuity. Others suggest that it can sometimes simplify a complex past grouping diverse experiences under a single term. You sense both possibilities as you continue. The name reveals, but it can also compress. The light softens again and the atmosphere becomes calm. You take a slow breath, letting the meaning of the word settle around you. It is no longer just a name you hear. It is something you will feel, a connection across time, a thread that has been present from the earliest moments of this journey even when it was not visible. You continue walking, aware that understanding this name changes how you see everything that came before. Persia is no longer separate from Iran. It is part of it, contained within it. The story is no longer divided between two identities, is unified though still complex. And as you move forward, you know that this unified identity will soon be tested again, shaped by forces that challenge how it's expressed in the modern world. You move forward, and the meaning of the name Iran begins to settle into daily life. It is no longer only a concept or a historical thread. It becomes something lived, something experienced in ordinary moments. And yet beneath this sense of clarity, you begin to feel a quiet tension. A broadly accepted historical reality is that in the early to mid-20th century, Iran faces the challenge of balancing modernization with deeply rooted cultural and religious traditions. The reforms you observed earlier continue to shape the country, but they do not affect everyone in the same way. You walk through a city where this contrast is visible. In one part, wide streets and new buildings reflects a vision of progress. In another, older neighborhoods continue their familiar rhythms shaped by customs that have existed for generations. These two worlds do not stand in open conflict, but they do not fully merge either. A lesser-known detail is how education becomes a central part of this transformation. New schools introduce modern subjects and methods while traditional forms of learning continue alongside them. This creates a generation that grows up with access to different ways of understanding the world, often navigating between them. You begin to notice how identity is no longer a single thread. It is becoming layered in new ways. Some researchers question whether these changes strengthen or weaken the sense of national identity. For some, modernization offers a path toward unity and strength. For others, it raises concerns about the loss of cultural authenticity. These perspectives exist side by side, shaping how different groups experience the same moment. You feel this contrast as you move through different spaces. In one, there is excitement, a sense of possibility. In another, there is hesitation, a desire to hold on to what is familiar. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how clothing, language use, and social behavior begin to reflect these differences. Some people adopt new styles and practices while others maintain traditional forms. These choices are not always deliberate statements. Often they are simply expressions of comfort, of identity, of belonging. You pause observing a group in conversation. Their words are calm, thoughtful. They speak of change of tradition, of what should be preserved and what might be adapted. There is no single answer, only a shared awareness that something important is unfolding. You begin to understand how identity can stretch. It does not break easily. Archaeologists continue discussing how this period is reflected in physical spaces. Urban development shows clear signs of modernization, while older structures remain in use, creating environments where past and present coexist closely. These spaces become visual representations of the choices being made. You walk along a street where both are present. A modern building stands beside an older one, each carrying its own sense of time. People move between them without pause, as though both belong equally to their world. You feel the balance again. Not stable, but active. Scholars remain divided about how this tension between tradition and modernization shapes long-term identity. Some argue that it creates a dynamic and adaptable society capable of evolving while maintaining continuity. Others suggest that it introduces lasting divisions that continue to influence the country's development. You sense both as you continue. There is growth, and there is strain. The light softens once more and the atmosphere becomes calm. You take a slow breath, letting the complexity of this moment settle around you. The land you are walking through is no longer defined only by its past or by a single vision of the future. It is negotiating between them. You continue forward, aware that this balance cannot remain unresolved forever. The quiet differences you see now will eventually gather into something more visible, more decisive. The identity of this land is being shaped not only by history, but by choice, and those choices will soon lead to a moment that transforms everything once again. You move forward, and the quiet tension between tradition and change begins to connect with something larger. It is no longer only internal. The world beyond this land is paying closer attention now, drawn by something that lies beneath the surface. You begin to feel its presence before you see it. A broadly accepted historical reality is the discovery and growing importance of oil in the early 20th century transforms Iran into a key point of global interest. What was once valued mainly for its history, culture, and position between regions now gains a new significance tied to energy and industry. You walk across a landscape where this transformation is taking shape. At first, it is subtle. New equipment appears, foreign specialists arrive. Conversations begin to include terms that were not part of daily life before. Then gradually the scale becomes clearer. Extraction sites expand, infrastructure grows. The land itself becomes part of a larger network that extends far beyond its borders. A lesser-known detail is how early oil agreements often granted significant control to foreign companies, limiting how much benefit remained within the country. These arrangements were complex, shaped by negotiation and pressure, and their effects were felt over many years. You begin to understand how resources can reshape identity, not by changing culture directly, but by altering relationships with the wider world. Some researchers question whether the discovery of oil brought more opportunity or more constraint during this period. On one hand, it introduced new wealth and global relevance. On the other, it increased external involvement in domestic affairs, creating tensions that would continue to grow. You feel this duality as you move through different spaces. In one area, there is activity and development, a sense of movement towards something new. In another, there is quiet concern and awareness that control over these changes is not entirely local. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how oil not only influences economics, but also shapes infrastructure and daily life. Roads are built, communication systems improve, and new patterns of work emerge. These changes extend beyond the extraction sites, affecting how people move, interact, and organize their lives. You pause near a place where workers gather. Their routine feels both familiar and different. The tasks are structured in new ways, connected to systems that reach beyond the immediate environment. The work is no longer only for local needs, it is part of a global demand. You begin to sense how the land is becoming more visible to the world, not just as a place with history, but as a place with strategic importance. Archaeologists continue discussing how this period of development is reflected in physical structures. Industrial facilities appear alongside of traditional landscapes, creating a contrast that highlights the speed and scale of change. These structures stand as markers of a new phase, one that connects the land to distant economies. You walk along a path where this contrast is clear. A natural landscape stretches out quiet and familiar. Nearby, a constructed site hums with activity, its purpose tied to something far beyond what can be seen. You feel the connection. It reaches outward. Scholars remain divided about how oil influenced the formation of modern Iranian identity. Some argue that it intensified the desire for national control and independence, especially in response to foreign involvement. Others suggest that it introduced complexities that made identity more difficult to define, linking the country to global systems in ways that could not easily be separated. You sense both possibilities as you continue. There is empowerment, and there is entanglement. The light softens again and the atmosphere becomes calm. You take a slow breath, letting the scale of this transformation settle around you. The land you are walking through is no longer only shaped by its own history. It's part of a global story, and that connection will soon lead to a moment where control, identity, and influence come into direct conflict. You continue forward, aware that the presence you feel now will not remain quiet. It will lead to decisions, to reactions, to a turning point that reshapes the path ahead. You move forward, and the quiet presence of global interest you sensed begins to gather into something more focused. It is no longer only influence or pressure in the background. It begins to shape events in a way that feels immediate, direct, and difficult to ignore. You sense a tightening of control. A well-established historical fact is that in 1953 a major political turning point occurs when Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh is removed from power in a coup supported by foreign intelligence agencies, particularly from the United States and the United Kingdom. This moment follows his attempt to nationalize Iran's oil industry, seeking greater control over the country's own resources. You walk through a city where the atmosphere feels tense, though not chaotic. Conversations are quieter now, more careful. There is an awareness that something significant has happened, something that reaches beyond the visible surface of daily life. It is not only a political event, it is a shift in trust, in perception, in how power is understood. A lesser-known detail is how the planning and execution of this coup involved not only external actors, but also internal elements including political figures, media influence, and organized demonstrations. This combination of forces created a situation where change appeared both sudden and complex, shaped by multiple layers of involvement. You begin to notice how events can unfold quietly before becoming visible. The decisions that led to this moment were not made all at once. They built over time. Some researchers question how much popular support existed for Mossadegh at the moment of his removal, and how that support changed during the unfolding events. While many saw him as a symbol of national independence, Others were influenced by economic pressures and political uncertainty. The full picture remains complex, shaped by competing narratives. You feel that complexity as you move through different parts of the city. In one area, there is a sense of loss, a quiet disappointment. In another, there is uncertainty, a feeling that the future has become less predictable. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how media and communication played a role in shaping public perception during this time. Messages, rumours, and information spread through newspapers and word of mouth, influencing how people understood what was happening. This flow of information, controlled and uncontrolled, became part of the event itself. You pause near a group gathered in discussion. Their voices are calm but serious. They speak of control, of independence, of what has been gained and what may have been lost. There is no clear consensus, only a shared awareness that something important has shifted. You begin to understand how this moment affects identity, not just politically but emotionally. Archaeologists continue discussing how this period is reflected in cultural expression. Literature, art, and personal accounts from this time often carry themes of uncertainty, resistance, and reflection. These expressions provide insight into how people experience the event beyond official records. You walk through a space where such expressions might exist. Words written, images created, each carrying a sense of questioning. They do not provide simple answers. They capture the feeling of a moment that is still being understood. You feel the weight of it, not overwhelming, but present. Scholars remain divided about how the 1953 coup shaped the long-term trajectory of Iran. Some view it as a decisive turning point that influenced later political developments and public sentiment toward foreign involvement. Others suggest that it was one of several critical moments interacting with broader trends that were already underway. You sense both interpretations as you continue. It is a turning point, but also part of a larger flow. The light softens again and the atmosphere becomes calm, though now it carries a deeper layer of awareness. You take a slow breath, letting the significance of this moment settle around you. The land you are walking through has not changed in form, but something within it has shifted, a sense of control, a sense of trust. You continue forward, aware that this moment will echo into the future. The questions it raises will not disappear. They will grow, shaping how people think, how they respond, how they understand their place in the world. And soon those questions will lead to a transformation that redefines everything once again. You move forward and the quiet tension left behind by the coup begins to settle into a new phase. The uncertainty you felt does not disappear. It reshapes itself into a different kind of direction, one guided more firmly from above. You begin to sense a rapid acceleration. A widely recognized historical fact is that after 1953, the rule of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi becomes more consolidated, and a series of reforms known as the White Revolution is introduced in the 1960s. These reforms aim to modernize the country through land redistribution, expansion of education, and efforts to industrialize the economy. You walk into a landscape that feels in motion. Change is no longer gradual or uncertain. It is visible, structured, and fast. New institutions appear, schools expand, urban areas grow, the rhythm of life begins to shift more noticeably than before. A lesser-known detail is how the White Revolution included programs aimed at increasing literacy, particularly in rural areas. Teachers were sent to villages, bringing education to communities that had previously had limited access. This effort begins to reshape how people engage with the world, opening new perspectives and possibilities. You begin to notice how knowledge spreads more widely. Conversations change. Expectations shift. Some researchers question whether the pace of these reforms allowed enough time for society to adapt. While many changes brought clear benefits such as improved infrastructure and education, they also created disruptions, especially in traditional ways of life. The balance between progress and stability becomes increasingly delicate. You feel this imbalance as you move through different spaces. In one area, there is enthusiasm, a sense that the country is moving forward. In another, there is discomfort, a feeling that familiar patterns are being replaced too quickly. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how migration from rural areas to cities increases during this period. As economic opportunities shift, many people move in search of new possibilities. This movement changes the social structure of cities, creating new communities and new challenges. You pause near a neighborhood that feels newly formed. The buildings are different, the layout more organized, yet still adapting. People from different backgrounds live close together, bringing with them a variety of traditions and experiences. The city becomes a place of convergence. You begin to understand how modernization reshapes not only systems but relationships. Archaeologists continue discussing how these changes are reflected in the built environment. Expanding cities, new transportation networks, and industrial zones all point to a transformation that is both rapid and far-reaching. These physical changes provide clear evidence of a society in transition. You walk along a road that did not exist before. It stretches forward, connecting places with a sense of purpose. Movement is easier, faster, more predictable. Yet the presence of older paths nearby reminds you that this is not a complete replacement, but an addition layered over what came before. You feel the contrast again. Old and new, side by side. Scholars remain divided about how these reforms influenced long-term stability. Some argue that modernization strengthened the country's position and capabilities. Others suggest that the speed and nature of the changes contributed to growing dissatisfaction among certain groups, particularly those who felt excluded or disrupted by the process. You sense both perspectives as you continue. There is progress, but also pressure. The light softens once more and the atmosphere becomes calm. You take a slow breath, letting the sense of rapid change settle around you. The land you are walking through is moving forward quickly, guided by a vision of development and strength. Yet beneath that movement you feel something building, a quiet response. Not yet fully visible, but present. You continue forward, aware that the pace of change cannot remain unchecked without consequence. The energy you feel now will soon gather into something more focused, more unified. And when it does, the direction of this land will change once again. You move forward and the momentum of rapid change begins to settle into something quieter yet more intense. The reforms you just witnessed continue on the surface, but beneath them something else is forming. It is not loud, it is not immediate, but it is growing. A widely recognized historical fact is that by the 1970s, dissatisfaction with the rule of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi had increased among various groups within Iranian society. Economic inequality, political restrictions, and cultural tensions all contributed to a sense that the direction of change was not shared equally by everyone. You walk through a city that feels both active and unsettled. The streets are busy, the buildings stand on tontel. The signs of modernization are still present, and yet there is a quiet difference in the way people move, in the way they speak, in the way they pause before expressing certain thoughts. A lesser-known detail is how intellectuals, students, and religious figures each played distinct roles in shaping this growing discontent. Their concerns were not identical, but they overlapped in important ways. Some focused on political freedom, others on cultural preservation, and still others on social justice. You begin to notice how different voices are starting to align. Not perfectly, but enough. Some researchers question whether this growing dissatisfaction was inevitable, given the pace of modernization, or whether different choices could have led to a more balanced outcome. The interaction between rapid reform and social response remains complex, with no single explanation fully capturing the moment. You feel this complexity as you move through different spaces. In one, people speak cautiously, aware of limitations on expression. In another, conversations carry a deeper tone, as though something important is being shared quietly, carefully. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how informal networks of communication become increasingly important during this time. Messages, ideas, and concerns spread through personal connections, through gatherings, through spaces that are not always visible from the outside. This allows awareness to grow even in environments where open expression is limited. You pause near a small group in discussion. Their voices are low but steady. There is a sense of understanding among them, a shared recognition that something is changing. It is not yet a movement in the open sense, but it is more than isolated concern. It is connection. You begin to understand how discontent does not always begin with the noise. It begins with awareness. Archaeologists continue discussing how this period is reflected in cultural expression. Writings, art, and personal accounts often reveal a growing sense of questioning, a search for meaning in the face of rapid change. These expressions provide insight into the emotional and intellectual landscape of the time. You walk through a space where such expressions might exist. A written line, a painted image, a spoken word. Each carries a hint of something deeper, something that is not fully expressed but clearly present. You feel the tension, not sharp, but steady. Scholars remain divided about how unified the opposition to the Shah truly was at this stage. Some argue that the various groups shared a common direction, while others suggest that their goals were quite different, coming together only in response to a shared dissatisfaction. This diversity would later shape the outcomes in complex ways. You sense both perspectives as you continue. There is unity, but also difference. The light softens again and the atmosphere becomes calm, though now it carries a deeper undercurrent. You take a slow breath, letting the quiet intensity settle around you. The land you are walking through is no longer only moving forward. It is reflecting, questioning, preparing. You continue forward, aware that this growing awareness cannot remain contained indefinitely. The quiet conversations, the shared concerns, the subtle connections will soon move into the open, and when they do, the transformation that follows will be impossible to ignore. You move forward, and the quiet undercurrent you have been feeling begins to rise into something visible. The careful conversations, the subtle connections, the shared awareness now gather into a collective presence that can no longer remain hidden. You feel the shift immediately. A widely accepted historical fact is that in 1979, a series of events known as the Iranian Revolution leads to the fall of the monarchy and the end of the rule of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. What had been building quietly for years now becomes a defining moment in the history of the country. You walk through a city where the atmosphere feels different. There is movement everywhere, yet it is not chaotic. It carries a sense of purpose, of direction. People gather in larger numbers now. Voices that were once quiet begin to be heard more clearly. A lesser-known detail is how diverse the groups involved in the revolution were. Religious leaders, students, workers, and intellectuals all contributed, each bringing their own perspectives and motivations. This diversity gives the movement strength but also complexity as different visions of the future exist within it. You begin to notice how shared momentum forms, not from identical goals, but from a common turning point. Some researchers question whether the outcome of the revolution was fully anticipated by those who participated in it. While many sought change, the exact direction that change would take was not always clear. The unfolding events reveal both intention and unpredictability. You feel this uncertainty as you move through the space. In one area, there is a sense of determination, a clear focus on transformation. In another, there is reflection, a quiet awareness that the future is still being shaped. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how symbols and messages play a central role during this period. Visual signs, spoken words, and shared imagery help unify people, creating a sense of connection across different groups. These symbols carry meaning that goes beyond language, reinforcing a shared experience. You pause near a gatherer where such symbols are present. They are simple yet powerful. People respond to them with recognition as though they reflect something already understood. The atmosphere feels connected even among those who have never met before. You begin to understand how movements are built not only on action, but on meaning. Archaeologists continue discussing how the physical spaces of cities change during this time. Public areas become places of gathering and expression, reflecting a shift in how people use and experience their environment. These changes are not permanent structures, but they leave a lasting impression on how space is understood. You walk through one of these areas. The energy feels focused yet calm. There is no need for urgency. The presence of so many people moving with shared intention creates its own sense of direction. You feel the transformation taking place, not only in governance, But in identity, scholars remain divided about how to interpret the Iranian Revolution in its full complexity. Some view it primarily as a response to political and economic conditions. Others emphasize the role of cultural and religious identity in shaping its direction. Many see it as a combination of factors interacting in ways that are difficult to separate. You sense all of these elements as you continue. They do not exist independently. They move together. The light softens once more and the atmosphere becomes calm, though now it carries a sense of completion. You take a slow breath, letting the significance of this moment settle around you. The land you are walking through has changed, not in its physical form, but in how it understands itself. You continue forward aware that this moment does not end the story. It begins a new chapter, one where identity will be redefined once again, shaped by the outcomes of this transformation. The name Iran now carries a new meaning, and that meaning is still unfolding. You move forward and the energy of transformation begins to settle into something more defined. The movement you just experienced does not disappear. It reshapes itself into a new structure, a new way of organizing belief, power, and identity. You begin to feel a different kind of stability. A widely recognized historical fact is that after the 1979 revolution, Iran becomes an Islamic republic, combining elements of religious authority with political governance under the leadership of figures such as Ruhollah Khomeini. This system reflects a vision that blends long-standing spiritual traditions with modern state structures. You walk through a city where this new identity is becoming visible. There is a sense of order returning, but it is not the same as before. The symbols you see, the language you hear, the way people gather and interact all reflect a shift in emphasis. Belief is not only personal, it is part of the public framework. A lesser-known detail is how the structure of governance includes both elected institutions and religious oversight, creating a system that operates through multiple layers of authority. This design aims at a balanced representation with adherence to guiding principles rooted in faith. You begin to notice how identity is now expressed more clearly in everyday life, not through a single element, but through a combination of culture, religion, and governance. Some researchers question how this system has evolved over time, particularly in how different elements of authority interact with one another. While the framework was established at a specific historical moment, its interpretation and application continue to develop in response to changing conditions. You feel this sense of ongoing development as you move through different spaces. In one area, the structure feels firmly established, guiding daily life with consistency. In another, there is quiet discussion, reflection on how the system functions and how it might continue to adapt. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how public rituals and commemorations play a role in reinforcing shared identity. These events bring people together, creating moments where history, belief, and community are experienced collectively. You pause near such a gathering. The atmosphere is calm, focused. People move with a sense of understanding, participating in something that connects them to both past and present. It is not only about remembering, it is about belonging. You begin to understand how identity has reached a new form. It is no longer hidden. It is no longer only emerging. It is defined. Archaeologists continue discussing how this period is reflected in urban and cultural spaces. Changes in architecture, public design, and social organization reveal how the new identity is expressed physically as well as conceptually. These changes are not uniform, but they provide insight into how the transformation is lived. You walk through a space where these elements are visible. The arrangement of buildings, the presence of symbols, the patterns of movement all reflect a sense of purpose. It is not imposed in a way that feels distant. It is integrated into the rhythm of daily life. You feel the continuity again. Even in this new form, the deeper threads of history remain. Scholars remain divided about how this modern identity relates to the long history you have followed. Some see it as a continuation of earlier patterns where belief and governance have often been closely linked. Others view it as a distinct phase shaped by unique circumstances of the 20th century. You sense both perspectives as you continue. There is continuity, and there is change. The light softens once more, and the atmosphere becomes calm. You take a slow breath, letting the sense of completion settle around you. The land you're walking through now carries all the layers you have seen: ancient roots, imperial power, cultural revival, modern transformation. You continue forward aware that the journey is approaching its final moment. The question that began this exploration is ready to be answered, not with a single conclusion, but with a deeper understanding. Persia did not disappear. Iran did not suddenly appear. They exist together as part of the same story. And now you're ready to see how that story continues. You move forward, and everything you have seen begins to settle into a quiet clarity. The long journey across time, across names, across empires and ideas, no longer feels like separate moments. It feels connected like a single thread that has been unfolding slowly, patiently, without ever truly breaking. You stand in the present, and yet the past is still here. A widely accepted historical understanding is that modern Iran carries within it the legacy of ancient Persia, not as something replaced, but as something absorbed and transformed. The name has changed in how it is presented to the world, but the deeper identity has continued, shaped by centuries of adaptation. You take a slow breath, letting that realization settle. The land beneath your feet has held many names, many rulers, many beliefs, and yet it has remained itself. A lesser-known detail is how even today the word Persian is still widely used to describe aspects of culture, especially in art, language, and cuisine. People speak of Persian poetry, Persian carpets, Persian history, even as the country itself is known as Iran. This dual usage reflects the continuity you have been following, showing how the past and present coexist in everyday language. You begin to see how both names live side by side, not in odd conflict, but in balance. Some researchers question whether the distinction between Persia and Iran is primarily linguistic, or if it reflects deeper differences in how history is interpreted. While the names carry different associations, the reality they describe remains connected. The difference lies more in perspective than in substance. You feel that perspective shift as you look back on everything you have experienced. What once seemed like a question of change now feels like a question of understanding. An interesting detail that often receives less attention is how identity in this land has consistently shown an ability to adapt without losing continuity. Through conquest, cultural shifts, and political transformation, the core elements of language, memory, and shared experience have persisted. This resilience is not always visible, but it is present in every era. You walk slowly, the pace of the journey easing. The sounds around you soften. The light grows gentler, spreading across the landscape in a calm, even tone. There is no urgency now, only reflection. You begin to understand that history is not a series of separate events. It is a continuous present. Archaeologists continue discussing how this continuity can be traced through material, culture, language, and tradition. While each period leaves its own mark, the connections between them reveal a deeper consistency that ties everything together. These connections are not always obvious, but they become clearer when viewed across time. You pause, letting that sense of continuity settle within you. You think back to the earliest moments of this journey, when the land had no single name, when identity existed in small communities shaped by survival and environment. You remember the rise of empire, the spread of culture, the quiet persistence through change. It all feels present now. Scholars remain divided about how best to define the relationship between ancient Persia and modern Iran. Some emphasize continuity, seeing a direct line that connects past and present. Others highlight transformation, noting how each era reshapes identity in new ways. Both perspectives offer insight, but neither alone captures the full picture. You sense that the truth lies in the space between them. Continuity within change. Change within continuity. The air feels softer now, almost still. You take another slow breath. The journey has not led to a single answer, but to a deeper understanding. Persia did not become Iran in a single moment. It unfolded into it. The name Iran did not replace Persia. It revealed a layer that had always been there. The story continues even now, shaped by new experiences, new choices, new interpretations. The identity of this land remains alive, not fixed but evolving just as it has always done. You allow the images to fade gently. The cities, the roads, the voices, the names. They do not disappear completely. They settle into memory and to understanding. Standing. The light dims slightly and the atmosphere becomes calm, almost quiet enough to rest within. You feel the weight of history, but it is not heavy. It is steady, reassuring. You have walked through centuries, through change and continuity, through names that both revealed and concealed. And now you can simply rest with that knowledge. Let it soften, let it settle, let it become part of the quiet. Sweet dreams.